Imagine standing in a courtroom where the very laws you're accused of breaking were created by the very hands of those who believe your existence itself is unnatural. For the women who dared to defy the law as pirates during the Golden Age of Piracy, this was their cruel reality. In a world governed by men, their punishment wasn't just about law-breaking, it was about their very gender, their audacity to step outside prescribed roles. Bonny and Mary, two of history's most notorious female pirates, were not only forced to face the wrath of the British Admiralty, but also the societal judgment that their very existence as pirates was a challenge to the natural order. Their trial was swift, their fate sealed before they even had a chance to speak. Even though Bonny tried to escape the noose by pleading pregnancy, a defense reserved for women, it was only a temporary reprieve. The system that had condemned them saw women like them as doubly transgressive, not just lawbreakers, but violators of the rigid gender norms that defined their worth and place in society. These women weren't just punished, they were made an example of. At execution, dock, the fate of pirates, male or female, was brutal and unforgiving. Female pirates, though rare, were hanged with the same finality as their male counterparts, their bodies strung up as warnings to anyone who dared challenge imperial law. The gallows weren't just a tool for justice. They were an instrument of fear, a public spectacle meant to reinforce the empire's control. Their screams, their suffering were meant to remind the world that defiance, especially from women, would not be tolerated. But the cruelty didn't end with the gallows. Female pirates who were lucky enough to escape death were often subjected to flogging, a humiliating public punishment designed not just to inflict pain, but to degrade them in front of crowds. This wasn't just justice. It was about control. It was a public act that stripped these women of their dignity, showing everyone what happened to those who dared to step outside their roles as women. The history of these female pirates is one of unyielding resilience, but it's also a story of a system that made sure their voices were silenced, their bodies broken, and their memories erased. These women were not only criminals, they were symbols of the terrifying power that gender and law held over women, and the price they paid for challenging that power. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Admiralty courts offered little mercy for female pirates, and their trials were not about justice, but about punishing women who dared to break the norms. Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most infamous female pirates in history, stood trial in 1720 for the crime of defying societal and imperial law. Yet their punishment was not only for piracy, it was for their very gender. As women in a male-dominated world, they were seen as doubly transgressive, not just as criminals, but as threats to the societal order. In a legal system that was constructed by men who deemed piracy unnatural for a woman, Bonny and Mary were already fighting an uphill battle when Bonny was condemned to death. She bitterly retorted to her lover, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." In a world where a woman's worth was measured by how well she conformed to prescribed roles, their audacity to take on the role of pirate was a challenge to the very foundation of that order. The punishment that awaited them was swift and brutal, designed not just to eliminate them as criminals, but to strip them of their humanity and silence them forever. Hanging was a common punishment for piracy, but for women it was even more degrading. At Execution Dock in London, female pirates were hanged with the same ruthless finality as their male counterparts. The gallows became a stage for public humiliation, where the bodies of the condemned swung in the air as a grotesque warning. The punishment was meant to instill fear in the hearts of others, to remind everyone that defiance, especially from women, would never be tolerated. And yet some women faced even darker fates. While death was an obvious outcome for many, for some the end was a quiet disappearance. Instead of being executed, many were sold into slavery, forced into lives of concubinage, or left to die slowly on prison ships. They were stripped of their identities, reduced to mere footnotes in history, forgotten not by accident, but by design. These women's stories are not just about piracy, they are about resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, about the brutal silencing of those who dared to break free from their prescribed roles. Their fate is a haunting reminder of how deeply society feared and punished women who defied its limits. Imagine the agony of being a woman in a courtroom where not only your crime but your very existence is deemed unnatural. In the world of piracy, during the 17th and 18th centuries, female pirates were not only fighting for their lives, but also against a system that viewed them as a threat to the very fabric of society. The British Admiralty courts were quick to condemn, and the fate of women accused of piracy was often sealed before they even spoke a word in their defense. For women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, their trial wasn't just about the crimes they had committed. It was a war against their very gender. Bonny, when sentenced to death, delivered her famous defiant words to her lover, Calico Jack. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." The irony of her words rings deep, for she was condemned not only for piracy, but also for daring to step outside the rigid roles that society had set for her as a woman. Their crime was not only a challenge to imperial law, but it was seen as an assault on gender norms, a violation of the very order that men had so carefully constructed to maintain control. For women who took up piracy, there was no mercy, only swift retribution. At Execution Dock in London, the gallows became a public theater where the condemned were led through the streets, paraded like trophies of the empire's control. The cruelty of their deaths, the slow strangulation under a short drop, wasn't just a punishment, it was a lesson for all to see. Female pirates, though rare, were made to suffer with the same brutal finality as their male counterparts. The bodies of the worst offenders were left to rot in public as a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance. However, not all female pirates were hanged. Some faced even darker fates. They were sold into slavery, forced into lives of concubinage, or left to die in the filthy holds of prison ships. Their identities erased, their histories forgotten. Many women paid the ultimate price, not just with their lives, but with the complete stripping of their humanity. The cruel irony is that the very women who defied the social order were erased from history, their voices silenced by the power of a system that feared their defiance. Their stories should not be forgotten. They are a chilling reminder of the price paid by those who dared to break free from the chains of gendered expectations. Imagine a time when being a woman who defied the expectations of society meant facing not just the law, but an entire system built to silence and punish you for your very existence. Female pirates during the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Bonny and Mary, faced a double jeopardy. They were not only breaking imperial law, but they were also challenging the deep-seated gender norms that confined women to roles of submission. In a world governed by men, the legal process was swift, and the verdict was often predetermined before they even had a chance to speak in their defense. For Bonny and Mary, their fate was sealed in a way that reflected both their defiance and their gender. When Anne was sentenced to death, her defiant words, If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog, echoed the bitter truth. Their punishment was not just for piracy, but for daring to step outside the bounds of what society deemed acceptable for women. The courts were indifferent to their pleas and their defense of pregnancy, known as pleading. The belly was the only concession allowed to women, but even this, as in their case, worked only temporarily. The gruesome reality of their executions at Execution Dock in London was not just an act of justice. It was a cruel display of power meant to instill fear. The women, though few in number, were executed with the same brutal finality as their male counterparts. Their bodies swayed in the air, serving as grim symbols of imperial control and the message that any defiance, especially from women, would not be tolerated. The spectacle of their deaths was designed to humiliate and break them, to show all who watched that stepping out of line had consequences far beyond death. Yet not all female pirates were hanged. Some were instead forced into lives of slavery, concubinage, or disappearance altogether, their identities erased, their stories forgotten. These women were discarded by history. For many, capture did not mean an end, but a slow, painful erasure from society, leaving behind only whispers of their names. The quiet death of their legacy is a reminder of the brutal lengths to which the system went to silence those who dared to defy it. These women were more than criminals. They were victims of a system that punished them not just for their actions, but for their very existence. Their fate is a stark reminder of the oppressive power of gendered expectations, and their voices deserve to be heard, even if only now, long after their time has passed. Imagine the haunting silence of a prison ship, where a woman's fate is sealed not by the courts, but by the isolation and suffering of a slow, agonizing death. For many female pirates in the 17th and 18th centuries, their capture did not lead to a swift execution. Instead, they were condemned to a life of invisibility, enduring horrific conditions that erased their identities and their stories. Women like Bonny and Mary Read may have faced trials and public executions, but for countless others, their ultimate punishment was one of quiet erasure. The prison ships that became their tombs were not designed for prolonged confinement, but they became the final resting place for those who defied the empire, stripped of all recognition and rights. These floating prisons filled with disease, filth, and unimaginable suffering were a fate worse than death. Prisoners were shackled below decks, confined in dark, airless holds, where diseases like typhus, dysentery, and smallpox spread rapidly. The conditions were brutal, and the women aboard these ships were doubly vulnerable, not just to starvation and illness, but to further exploitation and abuse by guards or sailors. Yet despite the harsh realities of these floating hells, history rarely recorded their suffering. These women were forgotten not by accident but by design. They were victims of a system that sought to bury them literally and figuratively, stripping away their names, their legacies, and their very humanity. The absence of their stories is a chilling reflection of the way society silenced the voices of those who dared to defy its rigid gender roles, while male pirates were often remembered as infamous legends. The women who fought beside them were either erased from history or relegated to footnotes in a narrative that was never meant to include them. Their punishment was not just death, it was oblivion. They were discarded not as legends, but as lessons in submission. The emptiness of their absence in history is a stark reminder of how deeply society feared women who broke free from the roles that had been forced upon them. In the end, the fate of these women serves as a haunting lesson in power control and the erasure of those who dare to defy the boundaries set for them. Their stories, if we choose to remember them, speak to the resilience of the human spirit, the harshness of societal structures, and the quiet suffering that history often leaves behind. Imagine a woman's voice once full of defiance, now silenced by the weight of societal expectations and the brutal systems designed to enforce them. During the 17th and 18th centuries, female pirates stood at the crossroads of law and gender, where their very existence as pirates defied not just the law, but the deeply ingrained gender norms of their time. Bonny and Mary, two of the most famous female pirates in history, faced the harsh reality of a legal system that saw their piracy as a direct challenge to the social order. Their trial wasn't just about the crime of piracy. It was about their gender, their refusal to conform to the roles society had set for them as women. At trial, their defense of pregnancy, a rare legal concession granted to women, offered temporary relief, but it wasn't a true escape. The court, operating without juries and with predetermined outcomes, had already judged them. The relentless speed of the trial, the lack of legal rights, and the cruelty of the sentencing left them with few options. Bonny bit her words to her lover. Calico Jack, if you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. Reveal the deep irony in her fate. The harsh reality was that as women, they were judged not just as criminals, but as transgressors of something much more profound, gender itself. For many female pirates, their fate was sealed not by the severity of their crime, but by their sex. The public executions at Execution Dock were a grotesque spectacle meant to reinforce the Empire's control and silence any further rebellion, especially from women. Though female pirates were few in number, they were met with the same brutal finality as men. Their bodies hung in public view as a warning to others. The gallows were not just a place of death. They were a stage for humiliation, a display of power meant to break the spirit of those who dared challenge the Empire's authority. Yet not all female pirates met their end at the gallows. Many were forced into slavery, concubinage, or left to die in the grim holds of prison ships. These women didn't just face death. They faced a slow, quiet erasure, their names lost to history, their suffering forgotten. They were victims of a system that stripped them not just of their freedom, but of their identity. The silence of their absence in the historical record speaks volumes about the power structures that sought to control and silence them. These women may have been forgotten by many, but their story is one of resilience, defiance, and the harsh realities of a world that feared women who refused to obey. Imagine the haunting fate of a woman whose rebellion against society's oppressive expectations cost her not just her life, but her very place in history. In the 17th and 18th centuries, female pirates were condemned not only for their criminal actions, but also for their defiance of deeply entrenched gender norms. For women like Bonny and Mary, their defiance was a double transgression. They were not only breaking the law, but also challenging the patriarchal order that restricted their roles and their identities. The courts they stood before were not interested in justice. They were set up to reinforce power, to make examples of women who dared to step outside the boundaries set for them. During their trial in 1720, Bonny and Mary faced an unrelenting system that judged them before they even had a chance to speak. The Admiralty courts, with their swift and unforgiving trials, often without juries and predetermined outcomes, showed no mercy to women. Bonny's defiant words, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog," are a testament to the bitter irony of their fate. She wasn't just condemned for piracy. She was punished for stepping outside the rigid confines of what was considered acceptable for women. The brutality of the punishments these women faced was not just physical. It was a public spectacle meant to humiliate, degrade, and instill fear. At Execution Dock in London, female pirates were hanged in the same grotesque manner as their male counterparts, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. The message was clear: defy the laws of the Empire and you will be made an example of regardless of your gender. The public nature of their execution was meant to strip them of their dignity and send a message to any woman daring to challenge the social order. But not all women met their end on the gallows. Some were forced into lives of slavery or concubinage, their existence reduced to mere tools for labor or pleasure. Their identities were erased, their stories lost to time. They were punished not just for their crimes, but for their defiance of a system that feared women who stepped beyond their prescribed roles. The fate of these women speaks to the deep-seated gendered power dynamics of their time. It reveals how deeply the world of piracy and the world at large feared women who defied it, and how history has often sought to erase their stories. These women, though forgotten by many, were powerful symbols of resistance, and their legacy, though silenced, should never be forgotten. As we reflect on the tragic and often forgotten stories of female pirates, we are reminded of the resilience and courage that these women displayed in the face of overwhelming odds. Their actions were not just about rebellion or crime. They were about breaking free from a world that sought to define and confine them based on their gender. Their punishments were severe, not just for their crimes, but for their defiance of the societal roles imposed upon them. The ultimate lesson here is one of strength and survival. These women fought not just against the law, but against an oppressive system that feared their power. Despite the brutal silencing of their voices, they remain symbols of resistance. In their stories, we see a reflection of the timeless battle for equality, for the right to be seen as equals, not as exceptions to the rule. As we continue to move forward, let us carry with us the legacy of these women. Let us remember their courage, their spirit, and their determination to fight for their freedom in a world that sought to keep them in the shadows. And may their stories inspire us to challenge the injustices of today, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to never forget the power of those who dare to defy the world around them.